If it had not been for the deaths of two young women, I would not exist. My grandfather John was 14 years old when he left Wilkes County, North Carolina, to go and live and farm with his Uncle Babe in Franklin County, North Carolina. And Uncle Babe was a sharecropper. And my grandfather lived with Uncle Babe. And while he was living with him, he met this young lady named Clara Griffin. And they fell in love. He lived with Uncle Babe for a few years. He loved Clara and he wanted to marry her. But unfortunately, Clara's parents would not allow them to get married. So it was time for my grandfather John to go back to Wilkes County, to his hometown. When he did, he met up with a young girl who was a childhood sweetheart of his as well. They had gone to school together. Her name was Valley Bird, spelt B-Y-R-D. Valley was a beautiful woman. She was absolutely gorgeous, very lovely, very sweet person. My grandfather said that when they were together, that they never had an argument in which they would go to bed angry with each other. It would be he basically put it that they never had any kind of arguments that were insurmountable. They had a bond. They absolutely loved each other. But at the same time, he loved Clara in Franklin County. Well, both my grandfather John and Valley were in their early 20s. They had a first child named Vernon. They had a second child 2 years later named Frances, a girl. And then Valley got pregnant for a third time. The third pregnancy, the baby was fully formed in the womb. She was in her last trimester. This was back in 1944. So one day when Valley was at home, and this wasn't too long before she was ready to deliver the child was stillborn. The child came out. She tried to get a hold of my grandfather, who was working or away at the time, but he couldn't get back to the house in time to take her to the hospital. Well, eventually that day he did find a way back to the house, and he took her to the hospital. The doctor said that the baby had died from drowning in fluid. It was a stillbirth. My grandfather and Valley were in the hospital room together. She was conscious. She was talking. While they were together, they discussed the fact that she had lost the baby. It was a very tragic thing. They had a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and then, of course, the child that I'm speaking of. So Valley and my grandfather John were together in the hospital room. Then my grandfather John went out of the room. While he was out of the room, Valley began to hemorrhage. What had happened is that she had given birth to the child. Something had ruptured inside of her body, and she just started to bleed. And she was bleeding out. As a matter of fact, they started blood transfusions on her. As fast as the blood would go in was as fast as it went out. So they were having a real problem stopping the bleeding. They were giving her blood, and my grandfather had a blood type that was compatible with everyone, and so he gave his own blood to try to save her. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and she bled to death. Because of this event, my grandfather was a widower. He had family around him who were supportive of him, but I can't imagine what that would be like, to lose your wife and your child in the same day. So what happened is they were buried together, the mother and the child, Valley and her daughter, in the same casket. They had an open casket viewing, so anyone could come up and pay their respects. I see the bodies of both Valley and her child. At that time in 1944, my grandfather paid $700 for the funeral. And that included a casket and a burial vault. She was buried in the second cement vault ever used in Wilkes County, North Carolina. And vaults were not plentiful back then. It wasn't a common thing. And so here he has a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and he's a widower, and he's just buried his wife and daughter together in Wilkes County. 6 months pass, and he decides to go back and to find the other love of his life, Clara, back in Franklin County. So he travels from Wilkes County to Franklin County. By that time, I believe that Clara's parents were dead, so she was free to be married. And he loved her, and he loved Valley. He was in love with both of them. God had taken Valley. It was more than just a need to have a female to raise his children, because he had to work. He was both a farmer and he was also a carpenter. But he loved Clara. Well, he married Clara 1945. Actually, let me back up for a second. Actually, it was 44, because Valley had died earlier in the year, and it was 6 months, and there are 12 months in a year. So yes, that's right. And in January of that year, 45, their first child together, Clara and John's, was conceived, and that child was my father. And if it had not been for the death of Valley, my grandfather would not have married Clara, and they would not have had my father, and therefore I would not exist. Clara and John went on to be married, and their marriage lasted for quite a while. In fact, it was 51 years. They stayed married for 51 years. She bore actually 3 children for him, and plus there was Bernard and Frances, my aunt and uncle from my grandfather's first marriage. A similar situation, slightly different, happened with my mother's father. My mother's father had been married for probably about 18 years, maybe 19 years, and or 20 or 21, and they had actually had 3 children together, just like my other grandfather. And just like my other grandfather, their child, their third child, the delivery of that child was the actual cause that led to the death of my other grandfather's wife. So what had happened is that she had given birth at home. It was intended to be a home birth. This took place in the late 40s. She had a child named Billy, my Uncle Billy. Billy had been brought into the world 10 days. Well, let me back up for a second. It was 10 days after Billy's birth that my grandfather Willis's first wife succumbed to a fever, and she died. And what is believed is that there was afterbirth that was left inside of her. Because back then, doctors came out to the house and children were born at home. The dead those that were dying were taken care of at home if there was no hospital available. This was an ordinary thing. And so they didn't have the technology. They obviously, what it seems to be, we're not sure, but the doctor didn't see the afterbirth or that there was still some in there, and that this caused a high fever, and this caused her death. Well, my grandfather, Willis, just like my grandfather John, was in the same situation like John was. And what happened was is that he himself was a farmer too, and he met a girl. Well, actually, he knew her. Her name was Esther. Actually, Esther was a cousin of his first wife. They met. It was somewhere around maybe a year, a little over a year after his first wife's death, and they got together and began to court. And rather than date, they courted back then. He asked her to marry her, and she married my grandfather, and she had one child, and her name was Betty, and Betty is my mother. So you see, you can call it fate, which I don't believe in. You can call it the providence of God, the permissive will of God. But it's the kind of thing the soap operas are made out of, because someone had to die in order for someone else to exist. So as you see, if it wasn't for the death of two women, I would not exist, because my parents would not have existed. Neither would my father's siblings, or my nephews, or or my sister, my siblings. So it's just an interesting story. I could only imagine that if I had lost a spouse, I would not be in a hurry to get married again so soon. It would be crushing to me. I think that people I would say my parents' generation, because that's what I'm talking about here, had a sense that life has to go on. As long as there's life, there is hope.